I had the good fortune, I think, to finish high school at age 15, worked for a year, went to Dartmouth College for a year plus before I turned 18. In the time at Dartmouth College, everybody in my class was a year or plus older than I was, so they were all gone by the time I got 18. So I just decided, well, if they hadn't won the war by then, I would come in and help them out. So I ran down and said, here I am.
And where did you do that? Where did you sign up?
In Bayside, Long Island, New York.
Is that where you were living at the time?
That's right.
And how did you come to serve in the Army versus other branches?
Because I was very nearsighted, and no other branch of the service would take me. Actually, that's not quite accurate. The Army wouldn't take me when I had my first physical. They said my sight was too bad. So I went to my eye doctor and said, could I borrow your eye charts? And he said yes. There were only 2 eye charts. And I memorized the eye charts, and I went back a second time to try again, and I passed. But I couldn't pass enough. I couldn't fake it enough to be able to be a pilot or submarine or anything like that. But I got in the Army.
And what was your family's reaction? What did they say?
I don't know. I think probably my mother was worried. My father was probably proud. I don't know. I can't remember. They knew I was going to do it as soon as I turned 18.
And what were those first days after your enlistment like for you? What did you do?
Well, I got in. I passed the physical at Grand Central Palace in New York City. And then they said, go home 10 days and get your life in order. I said, my life is already in order. I'm not going home. And they said, but you got to go home. We haven't had anything to do with you. And I said, no, I'm in the service and I want to get started right away. So they gave me a train ticket to go out to Camp Upton on Long Island. And I got there about midnight, and they weren't expecting me. They found me a bed, and that was the induction center where all people went for their first day in the service from the Army in New York City, and I was there. It's getting you in uniform and getting your hair cut and all that kind of stuff, and medical shots and so forth. And I was there for about a week or 10 days, and then I got shipped off to Fort Belvoir, Virginia, for basic training, engineer training in Fort Belvoir, Virginia.
Now, did you know anyone in that initial group? In other words, were there classmates or people you knew from town?
No.
In that group, it was just you, and you were now...
No, I was one of... that day in New York City when we all passed whatever it was, there were probably about 40 of them that went in the service, but they came from all over New York City. I didn't know any of them.
And what do you remember about your early training and instructors?
The early training was pretty arduous. I think the Corps of Engineers has an arduous basic training program in the time of war, at least it did as far as I was concerned. And a lot of hard work, a lot of basic training for an infantryman, plus engineer training. You learn how to handle all the weapons that an infantryman does, but you also have to learn how to build things and take things apart. And that's what we did. And that went on for about 4 months. We went on maneuvers up in the Blue Ridge Mountains for 10 days in the middle of winter, and it was sleeping in the snow. It was a cold maneuver. Yeah. But we all did it. we're kind of pleased that at least I was kind of pleased that I was able to do it well.
How did you and others react to military life as far as the structure and the regiment and having to do whatever you were told to do? Was that difficult to adjust?
I don't know that I don't remember finding it very difficult. I think I kind of expected it because I had lots of friends who were in the service who would come home for a short leave before I was eligible to be in the service. So I did have friends that said, hey, this is what's going on. Mm-hmm. So I wasn't apprehensive at all.
What were some memorable moments from the early days of your training, whether humorous or
Well, I let me just finish the last subject. We had very good officers, non-commissioned officers and commissioned officers that were doing the training, and some of them had been there and done that overseas. So I thought the cadre at basic training was excellent. I still think it was excellent. I still remember Sergeant Ineson and Corporal Reynolds.
Mm-hmm. Tell us about them. What were they like?
Sergeant Ineson had come back from the Pacific for training, and Corporal Reynolds had been in Panama. He'd been in the service in 1938 or 39, and he was a good man.
Does anything stand out in your mind? Any events or times
in basic training?
During your training?
The maneuvers up in the Blue Ridge Mountains when it was cold and there was you had to survive. Yeah. It was a very, as I said later on in my life, that was a preamble to the Battle of the Bulge as far as I was concerned.
So after your initial training, Mr. Hunt, where were you sent and what was that like?
Well, everybody that finished that basic training went off to a replacement depot somewhere in the country, engineer replacement depot. Mine was out Camp Reynolds in Western Pennsylvania. I went there. It was just a replacement depot where units out in the field around the world could send back, say, I need 10 men or whatever it is for this unit or that unit. And I was there for about 3 weeks. Then I got on a train. I was put on a train and went to New York City, at Penn Station. And there was a truck waiting for me, not just me, but a handful of others. And up to the dock in the Hudson River to get on the boat, the Ile-de-France, which was a big passenger liner in civilian times, and that was my transport to Scotland. And I had a good friend that told me, if you get on the troop ship and they ask for KP volunteers, volunteer for KPs. He'd been through it was a year and a half ahead of me in the military, but he told me volunteer because it's a cushy job, and he was right. All the rest of the people were like cattle and sleeping in the hole. They put the KPs in staterooms because they had to find them every morning to take them to the kitchen to work in the kitchen. So that Ile-de-France went from New York Harbor in a snow squall all by itself. No convoy, no coverage. It went scooting across the Atlantic, hoping to avoid submarines. And in 5.5 days, we were in Scotland.
Were you and others on the ship aware of what you were being sent to do, what you'd be finding over there?
I think the basic training was a good preamble, because we dug foxholes went into them when the tanks came and the tanks went over us, and we threw hand grenades, we fired mortar shells. I mean, we did all that stuff, but with no harm. You know, in the back of your mind, you may have to do that in the future, but you try not to think about it, I guess. I don't know. You didn't worry about it that much.
Okay. You mentioned that you had great training. And did you find that once you were really called upon to perform your duties, that you were prepared for everything, or did you find that there was some on-the-job training that came?
Well, I wound up in an engineer replacement depot in Scotland. No, I went from Scotland to England, northern England, Manchester, outside of Manchester, England. And from there, again, units were asking for people to fill holes in their cadre. And I went as the sole soldier all the way from northern England all the way down to the east coast of England, way south of London, on the English Channel, to join a battalion, a company in a battalion, of the 203rd Engineer Combat Battalion. Now, this was a battalion that had been preparing for the invasion of England, of France rather, for 2 years. And I was 18 years old, and the average age of the men in that unit was probably 25 to 26. And they were all welders and coal miners, motorboat people. Everybody had a skill, except yours truly, because all I had was college.
They must have sent you for a reason, though.
Well, because one of the sergeants was trying to demonstrate how to disassemble a German booby trap, and he made a mistake, and he lost a few fingers. So that left a vacancy in the sergeancy, so some corporal had to move up one level. Some PFC had to move up to a corporal. Some private had to move up to a PFC, and there was one vacancy in the unit. And this is in March of 1944, 3 months before the invasion. And that's when I joined them, and it was pretty hard to get into the laughing conversations with them about the bar fights down in Florida and Cape Cod where they practiced landings, because I wasn't there. But they were good guys. They were good guys. They tolerated me. They tolerated me. But it was very strenuous training. I mean, getting up in the middle of the night and going 20 miles was not unusual, and full field packs, and going up in the moors to blow up things and build things. It was a very. I learned in 3 months what these guys have been doing for 2 years.
Did you? And what was your awareness at that point of what you were training for? Did you know that this?
We knew we were going. Oh yes, we knew we were going to make an assault landing. Actually, there was a trial landing. There's a place in England, on the southeast coast of England, called Slapton Sands. It was taken over by the British government, turned over to the United States for the Omaha beach landings, because the terrain and the gradient of the beach and the compactness of the beach and everything was most similar to Omaha Beach. And we did assault landings there under live fire. And if you got more than 2.5 feet off the ground, you probably weren't going to go to Normandy, because you were going to be in a hospital somewhere. It was live fire, and it was a game, so to speak, because everybody who made a mistake was pointed to by the umpires as, "You're dead, lie there," and you had to lie there for the rest of the exercise, because you were dead or you were wounded. And so that's the way we learned. We did 2 of those exercises. So we knew we were going to do it.
So you were part of a much larger group, and what was that like? These were
The group we were a part of was called the 6th Engineer Special Brigade. Now, as far as I understand it, the U.S. Army had no other brigades during World War II except engineer special brigades. And these special brigades were consisted of 3 engineer combat battalions, amphibious combat battalions, trained amphibiously. And three battalions. There were 6 such brigades for the entire world. And anytime there was going to be a beach landing somewhere, the Army could call on one of these brigades, or destine one of these brigades for a particular landing. And three of the brigades worked in the Pacific, and 3 of them worked in Africa and Europe. And 2 of them did, and 1 of them worked in both places. So they were transported around purely for assault landings and river crossings. Where the primary purpose was. And that was what the 203rd Engineer Special Brigade, 203rd, Engineer Combat Special Brigade, that was designated for Normandy. And that's where we went.
Now, it was a large group. Everyone had their jobs to do. Did things work smoothly for the most part? Did people kind of know what they were to do? And
the training. Sometimes, in retrospect, parts of the training were harder than the landing, in a way. But the 6th Engineer Special Brigade had 3 battalions, and 2 were 8-hour D-Day battalions going to be, and 1 was going to be reserve. It turned out our battalion, the 203rd Engineer Combat Battalion, was the reserve battalion for the 6th Engineer Special Brigade. And we got on the boats to go to Normandy on June 1st. It was supposed to be June 5th was going to be the D-Day, but it turned out the weather was so bad it had to be postponed 24 hours.
if you would talk about what it was like to get on those boats and go.
We were from Paynton, England, where we were based, to the 203rd Engineer Combat Battalion. To get to the boats, we had to go to Wales, England. There was a special camp. When you went in, nothing went out. No messages went out. It was everybody in that camp was going to be involved in D-Day, and to keep the secret, that you were isolated. And we were there for about, I would say, 8 to 10 days at the camp in Wales, which we called the cage, because we felt like caged animals. And but in there, they had a three-dimensional layout of Omaha Beach. It showed every pillbox, every house, every boulder, everything that was on the beach. You could stand and look at it. They say, this is where you're going to land. Remember what you see, so you'll know what to do when you get on the beach. And so we could go in and look at that layout anytime we wanted to. It was in a long GI barracks building.
Did people spend a lot of time looking at that map?
Yeah, everybody memorized it. And of course, then at the end of the 8 or 10 days, sounds like ice falling off the roof. At the end of the 8 or 10 days, we loaded up in trucks and went down to the Welsh town of Abergavenny, where there was a railroad station. And there was a train waiting there, passenger train, with all the windows painted black. There were MPs on each car platform, end of the cars, and you went in and you couldn't go out after you got on the train. The train went right out down into Bristol, right out on the dock on the quay they called it, and you got off the train, and right there on the other side of the quay was the boat you were going over to Normandy on. And we walked across the quay, up the ladder into the boat. And that was June 1st.
It was June 1st, and how long did it take to get to your
Well, we pulled, after the boat was loaded, we were one company of combat engineers, amphibious combat engineers. That was the Company B of the 203rd Engineer Combat Battalion, and one company of 1st Division Infantry, both destined for Omaha Beach. When we were aboard that evening, the boat pulled out in the harbor, and we sat there for 3 days. About 3 days, huh?
What was that like for everybody?
That was the way to keep it secret. And at that point, it was beautiful weather. And June 5th was to be D-Day. H hour was 6 o'clock in the morning, I think, about 6 o'clock in the morning. And but then the weather turned bad. We started on I think late in the 3rd or early on the 4th of June for Omaha Beach, for Normandy. But we had to, in the middle of the trip, we had just gone around Land's End. A destroyer came along and signaled us to turn around because of the delay of 24 hours. We had to go back for 12 hours and then turn around and come back again and go retrace our steps for another 12 hours. But we wound up in the middle of the night off Omaha Beach on June 5th morning, June 6th. We couldn't see a thing, didn't know where we were. We knew that we were believed that when we got ashore, we were going to see what we saw on the map back there in Wales in the camp. So, and that's how we got to know Omaha Beach. We're anchored offshore in the middle of the night of June 5th to June 6th.
And then what?
Well, dawn comes up in June, in early June in Normandy, about probably 4:30 in the morning, maybe even closer to 4 o'clock. But here this boat was, and we knew we were now the reserve battalion. We learned that on the way over, that we were a reserve battalion. And that meant we were not going to go in at H hour. The other two battalions, the 147th and 149th Engineer Combat Battalions, the three battalions being the entire 6th Engineer Special Brigade, we knew that they were going to go in at H hour. The engineers had to go in before the infantry to take out the obstacles so the boats could get in for the infantry to land en masse, so to speak. So they went in at H hour. We sat on our boat till later in the day. But they had a rough time. Turned out they had about 50% casualties in the other two battalions for the H hour.
So from your boat you could see.
No, we were like, I don't know, miles offshore, 3 or 4 miles offshore. The shoreline was just a black line, so to speak, from where we were.
Were you aware of what was going on?
Oh yeah, because well aware. I'll tell you, but dawn came. You asked me about dawn, maybe about 4:30 in the morning. It was a gray, drizzly day. It was a very gray day. It was the aftermath of the storm that delayed the invasion, and very, very, very gray. And I went up on deck immediately after breakfast. Breakfast was at 3 o'clock in the morning in the hold. And I went up there to wait to see what we could see. And looking through the gloom, you couldn't see anything, but it started to dissipate a little bit. It became obvious that there was a ship off to our right, starboard. And the more we watched, the more it started taking shape until it turned into a battleship. And it was probably 150 yards from us. And it was the USS Texas. And at 10 minutes to 6, I think it was, the Texas opened fire on the beach. And that's the beginning of the battle for us. We were right near the Texas. And every time it fired, the Texas hardly moved, but our boat went like this, it jiggled. And it was an interesting morning. We just sat there all morning watching the firing. But when the was fully light, we could see all the boats, all the ships, all up along the beach, along the shoreline, I say. But our turn came, and we got off and went ashore too.
How did you come to come off the boat? Did you?
We had to get into a boat. I can't remember what the designation of it was. It's in my book, but it was a boat with a keel, and we had to climb down the ladders into it, the rope ladders. With it, I had to carry all the weapons I had. You were encouraged to carry twice as much weaponry as you could normally, as you did normally. And I had the part of a 50 caliber machine gun, the receiver. It's called the receiver, it's where the gun fits in a cradle, so to speak. And it was interesting to try to climb down that ladder where the boat was all wet and carrying almost as much as you weigh. About 80 pounds I carried at a weight of 155. But to get to the cadence where the boat you're getting into is up as high as it's going to be and as close to the ship as it's going to be. But it worked out. And then you had to, that boat went in within a mile of shore, I think, maybe, probably. And then we had to get into a landing craft, go down again into that landing craft to go ashore.
Can you kind of walk us through what you've carried all this equipment down, you're in the boat, and then you moved off, and then you went to another vehicle? Yeah,
we went, because the boat we were in had a keel. You couldn't go near the beach. We had to have a flat bottom boat. And we went into what's called an LCVP, landing craft vehicle. And it only carried 30 men. One platoon.
So you made it to the beach?
We got to the beach. We didn't go in where we were supposed to go. When the ramp went down and we looked up, there wasn't the things that we expected to see. We landed in a different place. But we had to get through the water. The water's up to your chest level, mine was.
So you had to get out of the boat and into the water?
Yeah, and with all your material and plod through the water.
Was this familiar territory?
No.
So this was not something that you
we were
looked at, or
I don't know. I would say we're at least a half a mile off from where we were planning to land, and that we had tried to memorize back in the cage in Wales. And we sat on the beach because they had to find out where we were going to go. So we sat back to the sea, to the shingle it was called. We sat there for probably half an hour, trying to stay out of line of fire.
What was that like?
It was scary. First time, I was so busy, and I think everybody else was pretty much the same, so busy getting off the boat, onto the boat, another boat, and off that boat, wading through the water, and you can hardly move because it was really up to my chest. And you're so focused on what you're doing, you didn't have time to be frightened. At least that's my theory. Yeah, but as soon as you got out of the water, I had time to sit down and look around and say, "Holy mackerel, look where I'm at," so to speak. Well, that's a polite way of putting it. But and you could see the awful destruction around you. You say, and as I put it in my book, without my knowing it, my knees started to shake. Literally, because we were hunched up against the shingle, knees drawn up, and they started to shake, and I couldn't stop them. I mean, it wasn't, they weren't paying attention to what I was telling them, but it didn't last too long, and I never had that happen again, although I had other difficult times.
Now you landed, you're on the beach, but you're not where you were expecting to be.
No, we
so
were
you're waiting for
somebody to right, and we moved off. Well, looking at the beach from the channel, we moved to our left, and I would say a few hundred yards. I don't remember how exactly, but to a dirt road. It was the E1 draw, I think. It was a dirt road that went up the bluff. You got to understand there's a bluff behind the beach, and we turned the corner, went up the road, and right at that intersection was a pillbox, but it had become the headquarters of the 6th Engineer Special Brigade. And we went up the road, and we got up the road a few hundred yards, and we got under, there was some machine gun fire that put us in the ditch, and came from a farmhouse. We were pinned down. I don't know if we were pinned down, at least we were told to stay in the ditch. And that looks like pinning down to me, but, fortunately, some of the 1st Division men that had been on the boat with us had gotten off ahead of us. They came up behind that farmhouse. The machine gun was in the 2nd floor of the farmhouse, shooting at the road, and they took care of the machine gun. So we didn't have to do it. All we had to go through the farmhouse and the barns and make sure there were no Germans there. The only Germans there were not playing.
What was that first assignment, that first job that you had once you had gotten off? What were you?
Our job was to go into the town of Treviers, where there was a bridge. They said the assumption would be across the Our River, and this is back in training now. The assumption was at Wales, at the cage, the assumption would be that the Germans would have blown that bridge. If the bridge is blown, the tanks couldn't get across the Our River. So our job, our first objective was to get to Treviers and make sure that the bridge was either okay or rebuild it, so the tanks could get over. We couldn't get to Treviers though.
What happened? What got in the way?
We got in the way. Well, we worked our way up to Saint Laurent, which is a little village there. It's a crossroads village, and we went past the crossroads, and a 1st Division man, our recon man, came back and said the 1st Division says there's nobody beyond him but Germans, and so we went back to the crossroad and dug in for the night. Engineers are not supposed to be infantry, because nobody else knows how to build the bridges that are necessary except the engineers. So you only act as an infantryman if you're caught in a situation where you can't do anything but that. So we're not intended to be infantrymen. And so that's why we went back to the crossroads.
So we went back to the crossroads and then and waited out some period.
We dug in at Foxhole and stayed the night there. Then the next day couldn't go to Treviers, so they said, well, go to Isigny. I'm saying they said, I don't know who said it, but I just know that privates didn't get much information from the generals directly. But our objective this time was to go down to Isigny, which is further down the coast, inland, because there were locks there that controlled the flow of water in the Our River, and they wanted to make sure that they were working. And if they weren't, we would try to put them in working order. Well, we couldn't get to Isigny either, because the Germans, they hadn't left there and hadn't been taken out of Isigny. So then they said, well, go to Canchi. And we walked to Canchi, and the story's in the book about what happened in Canchi.
As you're walking around, though, it sounds like there are a lot of...
We're walking along a road parallel to the beach, but maybe 3/4 of a mile or a mile inland. from your point of view, if this is the channel, you're inland where the Germans are. This is Saint Laurent here. This is Isigny here. And this is Canchi here. Canchi's up on the Our River too. And so we were supposed to go to Trevieres, which is over here, but we didn't. We went there, couldn't get there, but we went as far as the road to Canchi. And that's our first 3 days.
Yeah. So,
We did not get into any firefight, but it was close.
well, they were all over. They were,
Yeah, it was very fluid,
yeah.
very fluid. You could hear occasionally Germans talking at night. And you knew they were 2 fields away from you or 3 fields away from you. These were orchard fields.
Do you know that whether they knew you were 2 fields away?
Well, I think
or-
they probably did. I don't know. We would try not to make too much noise. But the thing was, we had 1st Division people, infantry, between us and the Germans, basically.